All right. So today we'll talk to you guys a little bit about developing a watershed plan for kind of a truncated area of the Harlem River watershed with a focus on natural resources. And so just for some kind of context and orientation, the Harlem River is technically a tidal strait, not actually a river that bisects Manhattan and the Bronx and New York City. And it also connects the Hudson River to both the East River and the Long Island Sounds. So it's the very tiny little gray sliver that you can see between or along the blue line for the watershed area. This really was a project funded by the New York State Department of State Local Waterfront Revitalization Program, and it was a 3-year project for us to develop a watershed plan. The boundary itself, because it's New York City, but also because we are with the Parks Department and really focus on a subset of the property within this watershed, really is kind of a hybrid between the topographic watershed itself and the sewer shed flowing to the Harlem River. It also, naturally, because we're New York City and a government agency, does not focus on the Westchester portions of the watershed. So there's a very delineated line right at the county or the city boundary. The focus of this plan was also on the Bronx side of the river for very specific reasons, but largely for, to some degree, DEIJ a focus. A community group really had been an advocate for us developing this plan for for several years, starting with other planning efforts that they had had for brownfields in the watershed, and expanding waterfront access and such. And so they really kind of advocated for us to be the leads for this plan, and that's how it has a larger kind of stormwater and natural resource focus. Stormwater too, because it was very reflective of all of the combined sewer overflows in the city, but also along the stretch of the Harlem River. It also contains one of the largest CSOs volumetrically citywide, which is at the north west side of the watershed, literally the top northwest side of the watershed. It contains the most of the stream flow for Tibbetts Brook, which is a stream that is piped into the sewer and either goes to the wastewater treatment plant or overflows to the Harlem River on wet days like today. So the community really advocated for the development of this plan alongside DEP's, New York City DEP's long-term control plan that they were developing under compliance with the Clean Water Act. So we were able to kind of really leverage those, leverage that planning process to provide something that's complementary and more focused on other aspects of that plan that they being DEP wouldn't necessarily be able to focus on. And as I mentioned, it builds off of past planning efforts like the BOA or Brownfield Opportunity Area Plan for a few brownfields along the Harlem River, right along the waterfront, and also a plan to extend the Harlem River Greenway. The plan itself provides the characterization of the watershed plan, but outlines new actions, priorities, and conceptual designs to really help drive funding towards this watershed in the future. Next slide. So this follows the Department of State process for a watershed plan. We did not do a 9-element plan. We did not identify any TMDLs for it. We really kind of followed the process of developing goals and objectives for the watershed plan in very close coordination with the community and community advocates who kind of vetted those final statements. We then went on to develop the characterization and assessments of the watershed itself, you know, identify the current context, current conditions, problems, and developed a characterization report, which then fed into recommendations for recommendations that were aimed at satisfying those goals. And then at the recommendation stage, we held a second community meeting to really make sure we hadn't missed anything, identified any glaring errors, and really to be able to identify what pieces the community had a greater concern for, whether or not it was priorities, or just identifying any instances that they problems that they knew about that we did not. We're the Parks Department, we manage resources citywide, and for many of them, these parks and green spaces and streets and waterfronts are their home and their backyard. And so in a lot of cases, they know them far better than we do. And then for the final community meeting, we prioritized those recommendations and then developed steps for really implementing. And then we presented the plan to them in a final community meeting. For folks that weren't able to join community meetings, this was all pre-pandemic, but we also prepared a website that allowed community to be able to access the site information, meeting notes, provide additional feedback as they wished. We also were able to publish a draft version of the plan on that website too for consumption. Next slide. And so just as a kind of quick rehashing of the timeframe, the project started in 2016, I think late 2016, and that was when we held our first community meeting. Second community meeting was in 2017, and our third in late 2018. Part of the reason that it only came out just barely a year ago is because we hired a consultant to, once the plan was basically done, we had a year and change sort of time frame between the contracting process and really, nailing down the layout and all of the pieces of it to make sure it was well communicated. We aimed to release the plan, I think, in March 2020, and is not super shockingly, that put a hold on our spending and also kind of a hold on our release. We also had some, I guess, reservations to some degree about, maybe not some degree, to a fairly large degree, about releasing a plan in such an uncertain budget climate. And so we held off throughout the course of the year and really kind of took 2020, as most of us probably did, to really reflect. And also then as protests erupted throughout the country, and particularly in New York City, about everything and anything associated with race or environmental justice and other relations, we really kind of took the time to make sure that to really revisit and evaluate the plan under a little bit more of a DEIJ lens than we necessarily had done so from the start, just to make sure we didn't have any glaring errors or omissions over the course of the last year. Next slide. So to develop the plan, we did so under the guidance of a watershed advisory committee, which included Bronx community boards, community groups, nonprofits, nonprofit partners, including other Friends of Parks groups, including other city agencies, so Department of City Planning, Environmental Protection, Transportation, state agencies as well, and federal agencies, including the Corps, EPA, USGS, Forest Service, and such. This really was aimed at providing coordinated oversight between government agencies and local nonprofits in support of the plan. And as I mentioned too, really a coordinated effort between coordinated and complementary effort, we hope to be to DEP's long-term control plan. So where they were focused more on water quality benefits in the larger Harlem River, we could, and CSO abatement, we could focus more locally on MS4 and quality benefits in smaller water bodies, for example. Next slide. And fortunately, this watershed also is part of the Urban Waters Federal Partnership, which is basically exactly what it sounds like. It's a partnership of federal agencies and communities aimed at improving local waterways. It's got to focus on community-led revitalization, particularly in urban areas and economically distressed communities. There are about 20, I think maybe now 21 partnerships throughout the country. I think there was a new one just announced. So for New York City, we have one watershed in particular, well, two, I guess, watersheds in this partnership. It's the Bronx and the Harlem River as they're side by side, that are led by an ambassador aimed at partnering with governmental agencies to advance some very specific goals. I know this is a very text heavy slide, but some of their focuses are working with the USGS and the Bronx River Alliance to monitor water quality and identify pollutant sources. They also do this with groups such as the Bronx Council for Environmental Quality and the Harlem River Working Group. They also work with these partners to expand water access and engagement and facilitate and promote watershed planning, habitat restoration, and green infrastructure throughout these watersheds. Next. So all of that kind of background context to it said, the vision and goals that really helped guide the development of the plan were as follows. So the vision was meant to be kind of an overarching guide for the plan development. And the community settled on the Harlem River watershed is a critical ecological and social resource where clean water, healthy habitats, public well-being, and access to these benefits are valued and protected. It's a place where environmentally sound practices, policies, education, and stewardship help maintain diverse native habitat, improve water quality, as well as public health, recreation, and a high quality of life available to local and adjacent communities. So overarching, I will say this with the kind of caveat, overarching themes for this that are not, that we didn't call out really directly in the plan because they were overarching throughout really all of the goals of the plan development were focused on kind of resilience and environmental justice. But they were so, I think, inherent to the plan's development in 2017 that they weren't directly called out. Although, you know, I think it could question maybe whether or not we should have called them out a little bit more directly. But more specific goals were really driven by the community input focused on protecting, restoring, and enhancing natural resources, managing stormwater, promoting access and connectivity, and maximizing public engagement and stewardship in the watershed. So next, we characterize the resource looking at its physical, biological, historical, and social characteristics and conditions. This characterization really directly informed the ideal state of the watershed for which goals and recommendations were derived for the plan itself. So these focused on geology, land use, community demographics, hydrology, water quality, climate vulnerability, and ecosystems and habitats. The top photo, oh, sorry, you can stay there, Jamie, sorry. The top photo on the right shows the Harlem River in, I think, the very, very early 1900s, looking north towards the George Washington Bridge from the High Bridge. So if you have ever been in a car leaving New York City, you have probably passed over this bridge. On the left is Manhattan and rocky outcrops. The right is a marshy shoreline. The photo below is actually looking south in the opposite direction from about the same vantage point. you can just tell, how in the last 120 years, this shoreline and watershed has been massively transformed. The area itself historically contained vast marshes, and geologically it was ridges of rock and valleys, often of marble, where the streams flowed through. One of the larger ones that's mostly still intact today in Van Cortlandt Park is Tibbetts Brook. But there was a significant amount of development along the watershed, including largely transportation arteries such as Metro North Railroad, the Major Deegan or Interstate 87 that connects up to Albany and beyond. The watershed itself now is about 66% impervious area, the bulk of which is impervious or still remains natural is in Van Cortlandt Park. There are only about 45 acres of wetlands remaining in the entire watershed, and 19 combined sewer overflows, one of which, as I mentioned, includes the bulk of Tibbetts Brook. This is an extremely diverse community. About 50% identifies as Latina, Latino, 44% Black or African American, and over 60% speak another language at home. It is one of the most economically distressed congressional districts contains one of the most economically distressed congressional districts in the entire country. So naturally, it is an environmental justice area, and parts of the waterfront have an asthma rate that are over 8 times the national average. There's also a huge amount of heat vulnerability in this watershed. Sometimes temperatures will differ as much as 50 degrees on any given day in the inner city compared to either the forests of the Van Cortlandt Park or along the watersheds. And I will pass it along to Jamie now to talk about the recommendations.
Great, thanks, Becca. And I do want to say it was so great to have Becca lay out the process of how we began this plan. And I'll move into how we move from that watershed characterization into actually understanding what the opportunities are, and then therefore developing strategies and recommendations based from that. When we talk about the goals of our watershed, we did focus on access, natural resources, stormwater infrastructure, and being able to implement those things. And as Becca had said, there's an overarching theme or connection to how those goals meet into DEIJ purposes. And so when we're thinking about characterization, for example, looking at climate vulnerability, those are indexes that bring in social vulnerability. We also are looking at, for green infrastructure, places where green infrastructure or street trees, places where there are fewer street trees, and also how that overlaps with the social vulnerability indexes. And so those investigations are things that we are using to be able to develop to understand what the opportunities are, and that feeds into our strategies and recommendations. So overall, the way these are nested within each other is that we have the overall goal, we have the goal, which is our ideal watershed condition. What do we want to aim for? And then the strategies are specific enough to be able to reach that goal. They give these general objectives for us to reach that goal. And then within those strategies, we have watershed-wide recommendations, recommendations that are applicable throughout the watershed, and then also looking at site-specific recommendations that need to be implemented on a local level or for a particular site. So as an example, oh, too fast, sorry. So as an example of what that might look like, for our goal of protecting and restoring natural resources, the strategy is to manage threats to ecosystem health. And one of the examples to do that is to reduce invasive plant species cover to 10% or less in forests. And when we get down to our recommendation level, we do want to put in measurable outcomes. So that will guide the process in terms of implementing our plan. And for our site-specific recommendation, it's going to be, monitoring and removing a specific type of invasive mile a minute throughout a certain area in Van Cortlandt Park. So this is the northeast woods of Van Cortlandt Park, which is one of the largest, actually one of the largest parks in the city, but it's also the major park and green space that's in the Bronx side of the Harlem River watershed. So before I go into the specific strategies, I wanted to remind us all of the goals. And so we have our watershed goals of enhancing natural resources and also managing stormwater, improving water quality through green infrastructure. And then we have more social goals, which are promoting access and connectivity and maximizing public education and engagement. So recognizing that it's entirely integrated. We have the environmental system is part, or both people and animals and plants are part of the environment, and being able to integrate all of these components into our plan was important. So then the way we've set up our strategies is to relate to these specific goals, but also understanding that they are not, I'm so sorry, they are not just connected to that particular goal. So this image sort of it sets up with the circles on the right, saying that when we expand ecological connectivity, there are goals of access and also stormwater that ecological connectivity relates to. And so being able to understand the relationships between those strategies was also helpful for us to identify who the key stakeholders would be that would help to implement these strategies, and also understand how one recommendation would feed into another. And then when we're looking at how to incorporate DEIJ, some of the specific, I won't read all of these strategies, but in particular, there are strategies that reference them in different ways. And so when, for example, with strategy 5, working across political boundaries to manage shared natural resources, it's really understanding the, oftentimes we have New York City politics are set up along community boards, and it's important to develop relationships beyond those boundaries, and to recognize that many people have different investments in the natural resources, and so that they can have investment in them. Another example is the collaborative partnerships. So Becca had mentioned many different factors on our watershed advisory committee, as well as people who were able to provide input onto the plan, and different organizations who are helping to implement these strategies and recommendations. And so understanding what the collaborative partnerships are and how to continue to maintain green infrastructure after they've been built is something that we felt was important to include. Building on collaborative partnerships, and that's also built into our strategy 12 as well. And then looking at outreach to and inclusion and ensuring clear communication, we have specific recommendations that help us to look at the policies and all the different agencies that are involved in the watershed, and how to be able to communicate those objectives in a way that is accessible to all people who are interested. And so as we build into these recommendations, some examples of how we've demonstrated them are, we have this map of our site-specific recommendation. We also have tables outlining what the recommendations are, and we identify what the priority projects are with our, and have conceptual designs associated with some of those priority projects. And there is a project lead in our recommendations where either we'll identify New York City Parks as a lead, or we'll identify another agency like the Department of Environmental Protection for many of the stormwater goals. And for other more localized priorities in specific areas, oftentimes we'll identify the local community group that's working in that area. If, for example, with a lot of our recommendations in Van Cortlandt Park, we have a group called the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance that's working with New York City Parks to implement some of those recommendations. And just to highlight a couple of the recommendations that we've included in our plan, we have Bridge Park South, which is sort of in the center of our watershed. It's a undeveloped area that was used for staging for the construction of the High Bridge for some time. And after that was done, it continues to require connection and development into a new park. So we're really excited that design is in progress and the construction is fully funded. And that will be an opportunity for us to transform an area that will be publicly accessible and also have different types of native habitats for people to experience, including grasslands, as well as a small living shoreline and wetland habitat. And it also affords people views of the river. So we're hoping that it will be an important, really valuable resource that people can enjoy. Another example is the Van Cortlandt Park stables. There's actually a stables in Van Cortlandt Park where you could go and take lessons, horseback riding lessons in New York City. So that's always fun. But we are looking at green infrastructure opportunities within that area, especially because there is just management from the stables themselves that is really unique, and we need to be able to address that. And so when we're talking about implementation, these are things that we continue to come back to. We work with our partners that have been identified to understand what the status is, and we also have one-pagers for our priority projects that we have developed. They're very short fact sheets, a series of them for the key projects that we want to focus on. And those are one-pagers that we want to make available to people to share with elected officials and others. So when we're focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, again, this is something that was inherent in our plan, but it was something that we also wanted to reevaluate in 2020 as we were all on pause. And we have specific recommendations and opportunities that we wanted to emphasize as a result of this. And so our plan calls for expanding the role of the Urban Waters Partnership, Federal Partnership Ambassador. It was really key to have that ambassador role to develop a deep connection to the community and to continue to communicate with the local organizations that are working there. And those local organizations really fed into our community engagement. And so now that the plan is done, we expect the role of the ambassador to assist with the implementation and continue to track and monitor how that performance is going. We also promote green job opportunities through our plan. And so, for example, with stewardship and street tree maintenance and care, those were opportunities that we provided through New York City Parks. The New York City Department of Environmental Protection has green infrastructure maintenance programs that allow for green jobs, and also another partner which is outside the watershed, but actually the Van Cortlandt Park Alliance has an internship program that allows for youth to to learn about conservation and management on the river and in the watershed. So when we're talking about increasing equity, we want to expand work and focus on areas where political voices aren't as loud. And the idea behind that is understanding where there may not have been investments in the past. And so that came out of part of our watershed characterization process. It also was something that was important to the community because this is, as Becca had said, this is something that the plan had come to us for, that the community organizations had come to us for, asking for for this plan to help identify those areas. And in terms of increasing accessibility, we had translators at our meetings. We tried to have diverse formats. We went to community events and brought our plan and shared about our plan. And so those were ways that we were trying to meet people where they were. And finally, looking at that, not simply focusing, especially in this watershed where we have a large green space and concentrated in particular areas, we also want to look at the local streets and understand what the opportunities were for street trees and green infrastructure and some of the smaller transportation corridors that we could use to green those areas and maximize benefits like air quality and reducing heat island effects. And so again, this is a work in progress. We certainly want to continue developing the recommendations and updating those recommendations, and as a result, continue to be a part of building DEIJ in the watershed and recognizing how important it is. So I just wanted to thank Emily for the opportunity to be able to talk and give you all our information, and you're welcome to contact us for any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie and Becca. It's really exciting to hear, the culmination of today's conference is the case study of your plan, which includes all of these different threads that we've been talking about and really grounds it, in a real planning process. So thank you so much. We've got a couple of great questions. One of them is, what have you learned about how to include diverse audiences? So you mentioned a couple of strategies there at the end. Were there other lessons learned as you implemented some of those strategies to connect with different audiences?
Yeah, it still continues to be a learning process. I think the biggest lesson that I learned is that it takes time and it takes a lot of investment. And we were very fortunate to have the Urban Waters Partnership Ambassador to continue to foster those relationships. And then also working with local community organizations was really critical so that they could be they already have the connections on the ground and we didn't need to reinvent that. So we wanted to be able to have them play a key role in that process.
Yeah, and I think I'll just add that it was, to me, I guess to some degree obvious, but it was hard to establish relationships where we did not have strong relationships in a few instances with local community groups who weren't really like as park specific, or they were more, borough-wide, county-wide sort of thing. And they didn't already have a very solid relationship with parks or city or other state or federal agencies. And that's still, I think, one of the biggest probably like gaps of the plan is not having had the time at the beginning to really kind of develop some new relationships going into the plan, where we really, it was a grant funded project, so we really had to start get running as quickly as possible, and where we really, tried to build off of the relationships that we already had, but there were certainly some gaps in voices, I think.
Thank you. And then a more specific question, during the community input stage, you mentioned a website that you built to get input. Was that successful? How did you get people to that website? Did you have a particular marketing strategy or budget to do that?
We had no budget or strategy. It was on the parks website. It was basically something that we would put up at community meetings, pass around at tabling events and such, with like a fact sheet that says, please go here and provide input. I think it was, I don't think we got much, if any, feedback on it, on actually like recommendations, where we had a feature where you could like put a pin and write down what your concern was or what your recommendation was. And I don't believe we ended up having any feedback on that, but it also served as a great landing page to send people to learn about the watershed, to send people to review a draft. It's where you can download the plan on the parks website now. And both, I believe both the English and Spanish translation links are up there. And so I think it's definitely been a good resource. I'm not sure what level of, we don't have a way of knowing what level of traffic it gets. So that's I'm not sure, outside of somebody Googling it and running across it or knowing what they're looking for, they're actually finding it. But it was shared on social media and, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, things like that. But it's certainly a gap for those who are not digitally inclined.
Great, thank you. Jamie, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I think the website itself as a static tool, it probably could have benefited from a stronger marketing strategy. But we, again, as Becca was saying, we're using it as an information repository. And then we certainly had people who were in the community that we specifically reached out to make sure that they had the website and disseminated it. And I think that was most successful.
Great, thank you. Have you connected your watershed goals with the UN's Sustainable Development Goals? And are members of the advisory committee connecting with some of those sustainable development goals?
We have not specifically, no.